Today, I'll be speaking to you about the politics of constructing the Sudan National Museum. This research began as a part of our work at Docomomo, Sudan, since I was researching the museum to write a report on the building. But I quickly began to realize that Sudan National Museum is so much more than just a building, and it sits at the intersection of so many defining moments in Sudan's history. In this presentation, I will examine the political landscape that has shaped the museum, from its relationship to colonialism, the geopolitics of Nile River, the UNESCO Nubia campaign, as well as its entanglement with Sudan's successive military dictatorships. This historical overview will reveal how the project was conceived, constructed, and expanded, and allows us to question the role of the museum's architecture as a medium for the power dynamics in the country. To give you some background, the founding of museums in Sudan is for the most part linked to the 1898 reconquest of the Sudan by the British. And because of their colonial explorations, the British began to collect archaeological objects and founded in 1904 the first archaeological museum at Gordon Memorial College. Shortly after, the first Ordinance of Antiquities was formulated in 1905. Sudan at the time was ruled by the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, but the convergence of interests between these two governing entities seems to have frayed over time. As Egypt gained its independence, it launched a large-scale propaganda campaign from the 1940s calling for the unification of the Nile Valley. This included experts publishing articles such as this special issue on the unity of the Nile Valley from the Engineers magazine in 1947. On the same year, Egypt tried to leverage the Cold War and appealed to the UN Security Council for British troops to immediately evacuate Sudan and Egypt in order to unite the Nile Valley. The British responded to this by funding education in Sudan from the early 1940s to cultivate a national identity and counter the Egyptian influence in the country. One potential avenue for this was utilizing archaeological research. Bushra Hamid argues that through Sudan Notes and Records, a journal established by the British administration in 1918, the British politicized archaeology to keep Sudan under British rule and diffuse Egyptian claims of sovereignty. Journal editorials called for a reconsideration of the history of the whole Nile Valley, especially from archaeological sources. Building on this narrative, a proposal for Sudan National Museum was publicized in Sudan Notes and Records, with the museum project framed as an important instrument of conservation and education that would spread knowledge on Sudan's history. However, the timing of these British colonial ambitions following World War II impeded their realization, since funds were not allocated to the museum after the war and the project was delayed. New urgency for the Sudan National Museum project became apparent when Egypt decided to build the Aswan High Dam in 1954. To build the dam, Egypt and Sudan needed to agree on the shares of each country of the Nile waters because of funding restrictions, which was very much related to the Cold War, and I won't get into right now. But negotiations were not moving forward because Egypt had been giving estimates that did not meet Sudan's expectations for the future of its agriculture as a newly independent country. This lasted for 4 years, and it took the military coup of Ibrahim Aboud in 1958 for talks to move forward. After less than a month of negotiations and amidst great controversy, the Nile Waters Agreement was signed in 1959. From the beginning of the project, it was clear that the Aswan High Dam would have catastrophic repercussions. The dam reservoir, Lake Nasser, would submerge the villages of over 100,000 Nubians in both Egypt and Sudan, as well as ancient antiquities dating back to 5,000 years. The reality of the imminent destruction of the cultural heritage in Nubia drove both Sudan and Egypt to appeal to UNESCO to help salvage the endangered sites and monuments. Thus, the UNESCO International Campaign to Save the Monuments of Nubia was launched in 1960. Hundreds of scientists from around the world began to arrive in Egypt and Sudan in the 1960s to excavate the endangered archaeological site in a collaboration that was historically unprecedented, but also problematic because half of the collections of new discoveries were gifted to participating countries. The Egyptian part of Lower Nubia had been thoroughly excavated at the turn of the 20th century. Sudanese Lower Nubia, on the other hand, was vastly underexplored due to the difficulty and high cost of reaching remote sites. After the Nubia campaign, some 1,500 sites were discovered in Lower Nubia, which would reposition the ancient kingdoms of Nubia as a rival to Egypt with their distinct civilization and history. Sudan identified 4 temples to be rescued as well as many other antiquities, and it was decided that these monuments would be moved to the new Sudan National Museum to make them more accessible to the public. To undertake the difficult task of dismantling, packing, transporting, and reconstructing the Nubian temples at the new Sudan National Museum in Khartoum, UNESCO and the Sudan Antiquities Service hired Friedrich Henkel, a German architect. How to deal with antiquities that could potentially turn to powder when dismantled was a very technical operation that required resourcefulness. Modern technological equipment was abandoned because of the astronomical costs of the operation, and instead ancient Egyptian construction techniques were adopted, except they were used in reverse. Nubians already living in their ancestral homes in Wadi Halfa were vital to this monumental task since their labor saw the project become a success. The heavy documentation of the UNESCO campaign, whose periodic reports reverberated in global news outlets, reveals Nubian workers braving the scorching sun as they worked tirelessly to rescue the heritage of their ancestors. As the monuments were rescued, Nubian villages were left to be submerged by the waters of Lake Nasser. 50,000 Sudanese Nubians were displaced from their homes, and most were resettled 600 kilometers away at Khashm al-Girba, which was the chosen relocation site by Aboud's government despite mass demonstrations in 1960. This was a clear separation between Nubian antiquities and Nubian people. At the site of the museum in Khartoum, Henkel designed an artificial lake as the main design feature of the museum's archaeological garden in reference of the Nile River. The reassembled Nubian temples were placed on the banks of this artificial lake in their proper geographical order and original orientation to resemble how they were positioned in Nubia. To protect the temples and antiquities from the weather of Khartoum, which is much rainier compared to that of Nubia, Henkel designed 3 movable steel structures that are supposed to open and close to shelter the rescued temples so that they can be exhibited in a more natural state 8 months of the year. However, in 1974, a UNESCO consultant advised that UV light is harmful to the painted displays, and since then, these movable structures no longer open. While the proximity of the museum to the confluence of the Nile River, as well as...
You have 1 minute left.
While the proximity of the museum to the confluence of the Nile River, as well as the artificial river within the archaeological garden are some of the most important features of the site, these bodies of water can be seen as symbols of the interwoven relationship between the museum and the history of Nubian displacement caused by the geopolitics of Nile water. Both rivers, whether natural or artificial, reference Nubian lands underwater and the separation between Nubian monuments and Nubian people, even though both were very much tied together through shared history and physical space. Only the names of the temples are now referencing the villages that thrived in Wadi Halfa: Buhin, Akasha, Semna. On the other hand, the main museum buildings were also constructed using UNESCO campaign funding. And alongside Alec Muller, who was one of the leading architects in Khartoum at the time, UNESCO hired Hans Asplund, a Swedish architect, as architect consultant for the museum. The museum was designed as blocks, and we see here the exhibition block and the administrative block behind it, where Sudan's National Corporation for Antiquities is located. Both these architects were European, since the architectural profession was not Sudanized at the time. When considering the history of the museum, it makes sense that it was heavily influenced by modernist design principles that show in the pure geometric forms and glass facades and entrance pilotis. The museum made the perfect modernist project from its colonial roots, the overwhelming international influence, which aligns perfectly with international style architecture. And we can even extract more associations, such as the modernism's relationship to power and its top-down approach, as well as modernism, siteless design, and how that was reinforced by the displaced Nubian temples. Ja'far Nimeri's regime is often credited to constructing the museum. And even though the project was ongoing for over a decade before Nimeri's military coup in 1969, this is likely because the government of Nimeri pushed for the museum to be inaugurated by the second anniversary of the coup. As Henkel reports in his book, costs were drastically reduced for the project to meet the deadline, which it did since it was inaugurated in May 1971. After Nimeri's political pivot to align himself with the Muslim Brotherhood, the regime instituted Sharia law in 1983, and afterwards requested a larger Islamic presence in the museum collections, which saw the medieval galleries expanding to include artifacts from Sudan's Islamic periods. These Islamist policies continued to shape the museum as Sudan's third military dictatorship came to power in 1989. Umar al-Bashir's Islamist regime brought about the desire to create a separate building for Islamic heritage. Construction began in the late 2000s, however, due to a lack of funds, which was influenced by the economic sanctions on Sudan and the government generally not prioritizing developmental projects in its public expenditure, the skeleton of the museum extension lay unfinished for over a decade and would never become an exhibit for Islamic heritage. It wasn't until this year that the extension was inaugurated, except now it houses a storeroom and laboratories for income. In comparing the new design of the extension with the original design of the museum blocks, it's evident that there is a disconnect between these buildings, and it raises questions on how extension projects of modernist heritage in Sudan are carried out. The museum extension, which sits adjacent to the original compound, features no identifiable connection to the museum's modernist buildings, in a missed opportunity for the new building to be in dialogue with the colonial and post-colonial architectural heritage in Sudan. When considering Sudan National Museum as the largest museum in Sudan, it's vital to consider how the museum was designed by foreigners, shaped by various international influences, and it's worth asking what it means architecturally for a museum to be national. There was a real opportunity here to design an extension for the museum that reflects the evolution of Sudanese architecture through time, which it unfortunately did not live up to. Just to conclude, the history of the museum's entanglement with politics and power relations in Sudan reveals that the museum's history is an archaeology of the defining moments in Sudan's history. All these political decisions and their drivers cannot be separated from the museum, and understanding the context that shaped the museum opens up questions about whose national image the museum represents when the building, its collections, and curations are driven by politics. Modern architecture here continues its legacy of close association to regimes of power, but it's worth asking, how do we revisit, reimagine, and carve a space for democratic architecture within these historic national buildings that are constantly caught in the currents of political influences and power dynamics? Thank you.